Welcome to Energy Talks, a regular podcast series featuring expert discussions on power system testing, data management, cybersecurity, and important trends in the power industry. My name is Scott Williams from the podcast team at OMICRON, and I will be your host. Hello, everyone. This episode is the first in a new Energy Talks miniseries exploring how software supports compliance readiness in power system testing and substation operations. Every diagnostic test leaves behind more than just a test report. It becomes part of a device's history. The settings applied, firmware installed, maintenance performed, configuration changes made, and documentation explaining what happened and why. As substations become more digital, preserving this history is becoming just as important as performing the work itself. Years later, another engineer, a cybersecurity team, or an auditor may need to understand what was done, which technical context applied, and why certain decisions were made. In this episode, OMICRON Regional Training Manager and Application Engineer Will Scheibe explains why asset history matters for compliance, cybersecurity, and grid resilience, and where OMICRON's ADMO software solution, used together with the Insight data visualization platform, fits into this picture by helping make critical device information easier to connect, review, and understand across the asset lifecycle. So without further delay, hello, Will. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Energy Talks about the use of software to support compliance readiness.
Hey, good to be here.
Well, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. Will, utilities have always maintained high standards for testing and maintenance. As power systems become increasingly digital, how has the role of test reports, settings, files, and configuration history changed as substations have become more digital?
Yeah, it's a good question. Utilities have always documented across the board. It's always been kind of the way they do things. You've always had to have a record of what you do because, as we'll talk about, decisions have a long life. So the difference today is that, as you mentioned, it's more digital. So this also opens up space for having more documentation than ever before. So where you typically would have a setting sheet or kind of more condensed information, has become much more information. And so that's a challenge, I think. And the other thing is that you have an evolution of data types, right? So you have people who have been working in the industry long enough to where you didn't have computers at one point. You have a mix of different types of files, and utilities are having to evolve to scan those files to put into their digital systems, and then also having the systems that they utilize in modern day work alongside them. Because I have to look at data across a span of 20, 30 years, and those data could be very different. The other thing that really affects the change has been really the collaboration between teams is much more intense these days. Engineering, operations, and as we all know, cybersecurity has become such a high topic. We have to have collaboration. And so having processes in place and systems in place to allow that collaboration has become very critical as we digitize.
Well, what do you see as the biggest forces driving this change from digital substations and connected devices to cybersecurity requirements and evolving workforce dynamics?
Yeah, as I mentioned, digitization definitely drives this change. It's a challenge, really, to take all these new evolving technologies and to turn them into processes that fit, or maybe sometimes it doesn't fit, but we have to put them into our workflow, right? Things like cybersecurity, as an example, no matter where you are in the world, you're being regulated on having to conform to cybersecurity standards, whether it's NIS2 in the EU or SIP, NERC-SIP in North America. We're having to evolve our workflows to adapt to these regulations. And this really is driving a big change because workflow management, with the amount of collaboration I mentioned previously, is difficult when you don't have a system in place to make it happen. So yeah, all that combined with more and more test data and device history, you have to transfer knowledge from generation to generation. So having tools in place to make it happen is definitely driving a change towards digitization, because it's easier to follow a software workflow than it is to teach somebody how to do it precisely in something else or between different softwares.
Great. Well, thank you for that explanation. Compliance today seems to extend well beyond passing as an audit. What does being compliance ready mean for a utility operating modern substations in practical terms?
And I think it's important to state that passing an audit, just like if you're getting audited for taxes or finance or anything like that, and it has nothing to do with the audit itself. It's daily work, right? So if I'm not doing my daily work properly and the processes aren't in place to make sure that the quality of data and the standards I'm being held to are done daily, then I'm already not doing it correctly, right? If I have to prepare for an audit in more ways than just gathering the information that the auditor needs, then I'm already behind. So this is what I would call compliance ready, is that your daily processes and daily work is, I would say, even better than what the auditors are expecting. If you're doing that well, then an audit is not stressful at all. It's just extra work when it comes along to gather the data. So that's what I'd call compliance ready, just daily operations being set in a way that exceeds expectations from auditors.
Utilities generate enormous amounts of asset and maintenance information. Where is the real challenge today in making sure engineers can understand it years later?
It's one thing to have all your data collected in one place. It's another thing to have it contextualized. You can have a bunch of information, but if you can't contextualize it and connect it across systems, and sometimes maybe it's not even in one bucket, it's in multiple big buckets, to connect them together. The real challenge is making sure that there is context to that data, regardless whether it's coming from a different system or within the same bucket. It's difficult to add context to something that was gathered years ago. As I mentioned before, it's important to add context as you're collecting it. Of course, lots of utilities are doing their best to add context to data that's already existing. I think that's a challenge in and of itself. But the real challenge is making sure that the process you have in place does that as you collect. And this really gives you a lot more confidence in records, right? Being able to go back and say, this particular test or this particular decision with settings was made with this context in mind. That's really the challenge these days. Because if you don't do that well, then the person coming along later may not have any idea why you did that.
Okay, well, that brings up the next question I have. In many organizations, the engineer who performed the original work may no longer be available a few years later. How important is that the next engineer understand not only what was done, but also why it was done?
Decisions really do have a long life. This is true anywhere in life. It's not just in power systems. You make a decision, it has an impact. And I wouldn't say that maybe in our industry there are right and wrong decisions, but typically you just try to make an informed one, right? And if you can make an informed decision, you want to be able to contextualize why you made that decision so that somebody coming back years later understands where you're coming from. Even if it wasn't perfect, they understand why you did what you did. I think that really preserving the context behind that decision is the key thing here. And having a tool that allows you to do that really helps the next person coming along saying, okay, why did this happen? Why did the setting change? Why was this test done this way? Why do we have this scheme set this way? A lot of these questions can be answered if you are preserving the context properly, if you're documenting as you should. And it also helps auditors. When an auditor probably asks the same questions, they say, why have you done it this way? Preserving the context helps a person that wasn't there to make the decision understand why it was made.
How has NIS2 changed the conversation around cybersecurity? Is it governance?
Yeah, good question. So NIS2 is a pretty broad, sweeping EU regulation. The way it's affected our industry is that you have to put in place a process for revision management when it comes to your firmwares for the purposes of cybersecurity, right? And I think that for purposes of NIS2, it's really them regulating, saying you have to have a process in place to communicate vulnerabilities. And as a software developer, this is something you should already be doing, but it is a challenge in kind of creating a separate process for communication, for creating some sort of openness with your customers. But for our industry, when it comes to utilities, really this affects the engineering teams, making sure that they are gathering all that information and making informed decisions about version management on their relays. So it's kind of a two-pronged thing when it comes to OMICRON ourselves, but also our customers. We have to do it as part of being a software developer, but our customers, the utilities, also have to consider it when deploying software, deploying firmware updates. It really does have to do with governance. I mean, it's important that we're making sure that our critical infrastructure is protected. In North America, in the USA, we have a similar thing with SIP. It's more refined to the power system itself, this regulation, but it is just about making sure that power system is one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure. If it's open to vulnerabilities, we need to know about it. We need to manage it. Governance definitely has pushed this forward because it is extra effort. A lot of OEMs and utilities probably wouldn't have focused on it as much if regulation didn't come along and say we needed to.
Very good. So, Will, against this backdrop, where does OMICRON's combined solution ADMO and Insight fit in? What operational challenge was it designed to solve?
ADMO and Insight was originally made for the purposes of compliance, regulatory compliance, specifically around, I would say, protection testing, but since then has evolved quite a bit. The biggest benefit I see from ADMO and Insight is operations in general. You have workflows across many teams, as we've talked about already, and their coordinated effort results in a record of what's happened, what decisions you made, why you made those decisions, work you've done, why you did that work that way. The purpose of ADMO and Insight, from our perspective, is to guide you along those workflows and to make sure that you're capturing context correctly and that it's easy to navigate and find that information later when necessary. So whether this is test records, setting management, collaboration across teams, configuration, whether it's firmware management or settings, as I mentioned, these are things that most utilities have a difficult time, they have a challenge making sure that they're doing it properly and sticking with a rigid workflow. And what ADMO does is we've kind of created these workflows, we've curated them with customers to be as optimal as possible. What we'd like is for customers that start using ADMO to adapt to these workflows so that they have a better, more rigid way of keeping up with engineering, operations, testing workflows, so that collaboration and data acquisition is much easier, so that when an audit comes along, you're well prepared. You've made decisions with context in mind. It's easy for auditors to look at, and it's easy for you to stay in this kind of constant compliance-ready state. And so that's the purpose. And of course, Insight fits in with that, with the reporting function. You don't have to have ADMO. You can go in and look at data and make sure it's all operating as you need.
Very good. So how does connecting this information improve everyday operations, not just compliance?
Compliance is a constant battle where you're constantly staying compliant through your everyday operations. Your decision-making, your collaboration amongst teams, your data acquisition, and therefore your revision history, your asset history, your device history are all done through these workflows that I mentioned. And this helps in a lot of ways, not just for compliance. It helps with making sure that when you want to go look and see within your own organization why you made a certain decision or how things are going, it's easier for you to do that. You're your own auditor a lot of times. You're your own check to make sure that the data you have is high quality, is not just a garbage in, garbage out, as we say in the US, and that when you do need to revisit some decision or some test or some process, it's easy to do so. And this is important. Outside of compliance, it's important for everyday operations because the way you do work is heavily influenced by these operational decisions and these workflows.
Okay. What do the organizations that handle this well do differently?
They make sure that their workflows are rigid, and obviously you have to have adaptability. Everybody that's tested a relay knows you have to have adaptability, but it's important that it's clear cut what you're doing every time you're doing something and how you do it. So the workflows, I would say, being standardized is an important aspect. And standardization in general is difficult. And I think the organizations that stay compliance ready are the ones that do standardization well. Standardizing not only settings and protection, but also workflows and test routines, things like that. Because when it comes to organizing data, you've already kind of standardized it. And the other big thing I would say is that they have much more intense collaboration across teams than is typical, I would say, for utilities or organizations that struggle with staying compliance ready. When you have a really intimate relationship between teams, when it's very collaborative and you're constantly working together, that just means that the workflows you have and the data you're collecting and the record of historization you're making is much more quality because you have context from multiple teams. And that really creates this transparent top to bottom transparency across the asset lifecycle, test lifecycle, engineering lifecycle. And it makes it much easier for you to see through the data to the real context of decisions and choices.
Looking ahead, what capabilities will utilities increasingly consider essential for managing asset information and demonstrating compliance?
That's a good question. I think that there's a few different capabilities. We've mentioned workflows already. I think that the capability of managing a workflow from top to bottom across teams, that really makes sure that the asset information you have is transparent and quality and understandable. You're not really compliant if you can't demonstrate it, right? So demonstrating compliance means that you have very clear, understandable asset history and information. And I would argue too that you're not really compliant if you also can't demonstrate the workflow you did to get that information and to get that info, because regulations about making sure that we're just doing it properly is almost as important, if not more important, than the data you actually have even collected. That creates this kind of transparent understanding of which teams made what decisions to get you from point A to point B, or from protection, concept, inception, all the way to testing and reliability of that protection scheme, just to use an example. That capability of kind of having the processes, I would say, is the biggest one that helps utilities really manage their asset information well enough to be considered compliant and to be able to demonstrate it to an auditor.
Very good. So, Will, if there's one mindset shift you'd encourage utilities to make today, what would it be?
This is a good question. I'm not sure I can come up with one mindset shift, but I do think that we have to consider that just storing information isn't enough. Just gathering data isn't enough. Just test reports, as left, as found settings, just these things isn't really enough to be compliant, or honestly, even just to be within an organization to be resilient. You really have to add context to everything, not only so the next person can understand what's happening, but also I think to make an informed decision and to be confident about the decision, you have to understand the context of everything else happening. And having a workflow between different teams within the team helps you make that kind of informed decision. And the thing that I would just leave with when it comes to the mindset shift is that the process of gathering the data, the whole workflow, is the most important thing. You will gather more accurate, more interesting, more contextual data if the process is in place properly. I can have all the ingredients to make a meal, but if I don't have the process of cooking it right, it's not going to taste very good, right? Because there's no context to the flavor. So in the same way, at a utility or at an organization, setting in place the processes to make decisions and to gather data is just as important as the decisions and the data themselves.
Very good point for wrapping up. Thank you, Will, for sharing your insights into this topic on this episode of Energy Talks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And a big thank you to our audience for listening to this and other episodes of Energy Talks. We always welcome your questions and feedback. Please send us an email to podcast@omicronenergy.com. OMICRON has several years of experience in power system testing, data management, and cybersecurity, and offers a matching solution for your application. For more information, visit our website at omicronenergy.com. Please join us for the next episode of Energy Talks. Goodbye for now, everyone.